I know everyone in here's sole interest is Broadway, the Broadway Corridor, and making sure that the north end of the neighborhood experiences redevelopment. So what I wanted to share with you today was a follow-up from meetings that you may have had in the past with some of our staff, and a few things that have happened in the last few weeks that I think are really going to set us on the path towards taking Broadway to that next level where it needs to be. Just a few things, before we go there. The previous meetings that have been held in regards to Broadway have been done with a consultant that we hired and with existing CRA staff. I'm sure some of you have sat in community meetings and forums and provided input, and what resulted from that was the base of an economic development plan to really make sure that the community weighed in on what issues and what some of the things that you viewed as either residents or business or property owners were Broadway's biggest obstacles. Those kind of economic development plans are important. You have to set the stage. But then what happens is something a little bit different. At a certain point, you go from the planning documents and you go from, gee, this looks good on paper, to how are we going to get there? And for those of you that have been in the city long enough to remember what Northwood Village was and what Northwood Village is becoming, you watched that process happen. For some of you that weren't there, Northwood Village was very blighted. There were a lot of vacancies. The kind of businesses that operated out of the area were not all legal. There was prostitution. There were drug activity running out of the individual businesses. Pedestrians were not found on a regular basis in Northwood. And when they first restructured the CRA, which I'm the director of, the question was, how are we going to turn Northwood around? And we went through that same process. And I take a minute to share that with you because we're entering a really important phase of what has to happen next to take Broadway to that level. The Northwood Village problems were not a whole lot different than what Broadway has. And I'll show you that as we go through this as we go through this PowerPoint presentation. And another thing to consider is that as we start to move forward, we have to start talking differently about what our priorities are. We can't talk necessarily about, well, it's unsafe, or, well, you can't cross a street that easily, or, well, this is a problem. What we start to have to try to do is reframe the image of what Broadway needs to become. That's the fun part, but that's the hard part. So as of today, I think what you will start to hear us talk about is what is it that really has to happen to reframe and rephrase the discussion about redevelopment. And again, many of you have seen in Northwood, it was a combination of things, some of which we're going to do in Broadway, some of which we won't need to do, that changed that area. But it started with the vision, and it started with the understanding that Northwood Village was going to become an urban village, a bohemian-style location where unique, one-of-a-kind businesses would locate. And it was going to be a place that residents and pedestrians would come back to, and the core that the private sector was willing to invest in. Well, we have that same issue right now, and it's really down to this one key message. The private sector is not coming to Broadway, and something is stopping them. We have to get down to the nitty-gritty of what is it that's going to attract private investment, because no government programs in the world and no amount of money in the world is going to revitalize Broadway. There's not enough police to get rid of crime to do that. There's not enough code enforcement to fix the code problems. If the private sector won't come, we can't fix Broadway. We're in a really fortunate situation that we have private sector partners that are out there and they're interested in coming. You all are very familiar with Carlos Videra from Rybovich, and he joined us today because, again, he's a key partner in this. You all are familiar with some of the residential development and activity that's taking place out there. So what we're going to talk about, and I'm going to spend just a few minutes, is sharing with you some things that have happened over the last few weeks of taking this private sector investment and making sure that we lay the foundation so that more of it will come. One of the things that we have in the North End, and it's an advantage that many other coastal cities don't have, is that marine base. That's not news to you. It's old news. You've had it for a while. But the key difference here is that you have that private sector investment, maybe through Rybovich, who is willing to step up and make a substantial investment that will draw that private activity. They are not thinking small. They're thinking very, very big, and not big in terms of volume necessarily, but in terms of economic impact. the amount of investment that they intend to make and the amount of private business that will follow because of their activities is huge. When we look at a redevelopment, just like we did in Northwood of Broadway, the only way, again, to push the crime out, get the code enforcement issues to go away, get people to want to live here again and bring business, is to change our image. You've heard us talk about the Northwood Village, or the urban village and the marine village starting to become a bit of a theme. And I put this picture up here because, again, Carlos gave it to me and suggested that not even thinking citywide or statewide or South Florida-wide, but thinking internationally of where we can take this marine industry. It is so large, the industry is so big, and there's so much interest in being around what they're doing that there is international attention that we can draw to this. If you look at the synergy also between yachting, boating activity, and residential, how Monaco redeveloped and what this city used to be and what this township was versus what it became is a very similar redevelopment process to what we're going to be going through. If you also look at the marine industry contiguous to us in cities to the north of us and not too far south, there's a cluster that can form that we can feed off of to attract new businesses. Rybovich, obviously, and this is their boatyard and their place for services, is not only, again, right in the middle of all of it, but they are well on their way to rehabilitating what will be an attraction for some of the largest ship and the ship repairs. Look at to the north, again, the proximity of Riviera Beach. You all are very familiar with what's going on up there, I'm sure. And again, the impact of Riviera Beach to us from a positive and negative can't be understated. So when we're looking at redevelopment, we're saying, how does Riviera Beach affect us? Positive, negative, how can we affect them? It's positive because they've got, obviously, the marine industry. It's negative because some of the issues associated with the Broadway Corridor don't stop at the city line. This is the context from here forward that I'd like us to focus on. The size, scale, and impact of that marine, and it's that, I can't point to it because I'm in front of the screen, but the large yellow square off to the right is the marina. That is where the bulk of this kind of private activity will start, and the yellow dots are the things that either CRA or city owns, and down to the south is Northwood Village. There is a clear connection between these things that must happen. We can't just talk about the residential neighborhoods, or we can't just talk about Broadway Corridor and businesses. We have to recognize and look at the connection of this, that the direct economic impact is going to come out of this private activity pretty much in the shape that you're seeing here. Why? Because it's the path of least resistance for people to move, and it's also the direct link between private activity at the marina and private activity that can take place on Broadway. The residential neighborhoods get caught up in that, but there is definitely a target area that we're honing in on. The connection between the two is obvious. Rybovich already has some of their transportation. But even when we're talking about this marine village, just like we talked about Northwood Village, the marine village has to take on an image. It's not fast cars. It's not driving through neighborhoods fast. It's not big vehicles and trucks. It's small-scale, quaint, village-style transportation internally. You already know the assets that we have up there and some of the things that have happened. But the things that haven't happened become obvious when you look at this picture collage. We have Palm Beach Yachts. Palm Beach Yachts was one of the first marine businesses that opened on Broadway. They've also been about the only business that opened on Broadway. CRA has incentives. We helped them open, but no others came. Why not? There's a combination of things that the private businesses will tell you, and Carlos will say, I can bring those businesses up here, but they will not go to Broadway and open the business because, and I'll show you in a minute a few other issues. Residential, we have some of it that's been built, but again, it hasn't gone quickly enough. The bottom right is Northwood Village, back to that connection of pedestrians, and obviously tied into the marine is the Maritime Museum. Here's where we're at today, and here's, again, where we really have to change our way of thinking. On Broadway right now, and even though we're talking about Broadway Corridor, keep in mind the images and the connection that I just shared with you. Right now, cars rule. They are the sole priority of the entire functioning of the North End. It's all about how to get cars from point A to point B. I'm going to suggest, and we had this same issue in Northwood, that unless everybody is on the same page as far as realigning that priority of the cars, we're not going to be able to change it. The reason is if FDOT, who owns the street, or the city, who it's in the city jurisdiction, says that the way that the traffic is flowing and the way that the cars are getting from point A to point B and the speed they're going at, if all that is the top priority, then we can't change it. The second is the businesses. Businesses are locating there. You can park, sort of. You can get in and out of those businesses, sort of, but they are not the top priority. And the third is the pedestrians. If you try to cross the street, you know you can't. And the residents, you know, if you're back in there and you try to pull out or even just to get in and out of the neighborhood, it's not a priority. We have to realign that. The businesses and the pedestrians have to become the top priority. Cars and transportation and transit have to become secondary. If you look at Northwood Village, again, we had the exact same problem, and it was a combination of on-street versus on-site parking. The difference, obviously, is speed and length of this street called Broadway. Even the name Broadway conjures up an image to you. It conjures up an image to people that don't live in West Palm, and it conjures up an image of people that we want to come here. So when we're talking about this street and the cars who right now rule, we have to turn this around, that it's about how are the cars going to get from point A to point B, where are they going to park, is it on street or on site, and what impact is that going to have on the businesses? That starts to turn it around. This is Broadway. Broadway, as you know, again, is a super speedy street. I'm sure when Rachel went through, Ms. Bach, our consultant, went through a lot of the pros and cons of the street, you talked a lot about this. But there are two things that engineers refer to when they're talking about changing how roads operate. One is called a road diet, one's called a time tax. Road diet is what it sounds like. The street has to shrink. It either has to shrink in speed, it has to shrink in size, or it has to shrink in how it's functioning, which means, in fact, that yes, it's not going to be as convenient to barrel through for the 2 miles at the same speed. But in order for Broadway to change, it's got to go on that diet. The result of that is what a lot of engineers call a time tax, meaning that the result may be it takes a little bit more time to get where you're going. Right now, this street functions at a level D, and Alex Hansen is here. He just recently went to Tallahassee with us, which I'll tell you about in a minute. And we were talking to FDOT about what does that mean to FDOT. And remember, normally an engineer's function, and FDOT's function, is to move cars. We were trying to find a common ground with FDOT of the whole thing that we just talked about, which is our priorities, which is businesses, versus moving the cars. They understand this concept. They understand that the combination of on-street parking and on-site parking, which the picture on the left shows you, we've got phenomenal opportunities. There is not a tremendous amount of traffic. There's not any on-street parking, and there's plenty of on-site parking if we figure it out the way we did in Northwood. The last constraint that you have up there, and something that we've started to talk to FDOT about, is where and how those time tax and diets will take place. What parts of the road have to slow down? Then you start to get into discussions with the police, you start to get into discussions with fire. How are you going to do that in a way that's conducive to them being able to do what they do best and at the same time attract the redevelopment? We cannot go back into the neighborhoods, so these buildings are not going to get bigger. They're not going to get knocked down with new uses coming in. All the things that have to happen out there, just like Northwood, have to happen in all the confines that are currently existing. It's going to be rehabilitation, it's going to be a combination of on-street and on-site parking, and it's going to be reuses and different types of usage of that area. And in summary, and one of the things, again, the reason we put this slide up that I want to show you is when we went up to Tallahassee, and the whole point of going up there was to take the message from Rybovich and from the residential developers and from the private sector folks who want to invest in our city, and they had a consistent message, which is we want to come here, we want to invest on Broadway, we want to see some new businesses come in, but the area is not conducive for it. We can't fix it alone with putting on-street parking. We can't fix it alone with providing on-site parking. Here's an example if we were to even add some landscaping, which would be great. And even if we did some facades, as you saw with the Palm Beach yacht building, that alone won't do it. But the combination of those things will. What we had asked FDOT when we took that message up there about private sector investment is, will you give us a section of Broadway that we can use as a pilot project. And we want to test all those things at one time. We want to make the traffic go slower. We want to put on-street parking and leave it on-street parking for a period of time, be it 1, 3, 6 months, however long we all decide that's going to be. We want to see if there's room for a bike lane that's in a safe lane. We want to change the way the sidewalk is functioning. We do want to have, even if it's temporary, we want to have some kind of landscaping. Even if we're not going to go out and dig up roads right now because we have to test this, can we put landscaping and trees in pots so that, again, the pedestrian way of walking down that street changes because you're creating a barrier. And then we want to look at those buildings and see if there's improvements that can be made to those buildings so that you have a window of time that you can look at a reconfiguration and a refunctioning of those buildings and see if that starts to enable us to get that private sector to come here. But for that, our chances of changing Broadway are very, very slim. Because again, no one of those things is going to work on its own. FDOT was very, very receptive. They not only said, yes, we'll look at that, they clearly recognize that there's not a big traffic issue. It's not like there's traffic jams and the 2 or 4 lanes are jam-packed morning till night. All they're interested in is safety. They want to make sure that if there's some form of enforcement, that the police know how to enforce, and they want to make sure that it functions in a way that's manageable. So at this point, the hard work that everybody's put in over the last 6, 8, 12 months in terms of reinvigorating the Broadway initiative has resulted in the base economic development plan. It's resulted in our biggest obstacle, which is changing how the street functions, with us getting a green light from FDOT. Now we'll go back inside, we'll sit with the engineers, we'll sit with police, we'll sit with fire, we'll sit with an internal team to create this pilot mock-up section of Broadway and with those property owners and see if we can start to change the imaging and the visioning of what that area can become. I don't think anybody, to finish, when we first started talking about Northwood, quite believed what was going to happen. There was quite a few people that just said, that's not going to work, that's not going to happen. It did happen. And it wasn't rocket science, it wasn't easy, but it was a combination of the right things that had to happen at the right time, and they had to happen fairly quickly. So what we're going to do right now is what the mayor and commission have directed us to do, which is put all efforts right now on focusing on Broadway. The CRA will be reorganized, and we're going to talk about restructuring so that we've got the staff resources to do this. We're not talking about a lot of financial investment at this stage, but we'll have to address how to fund and finance this long term. And then you as residents and property owners are going to be the key in making this move forward. So I really did appreciate your district commissioner here, who's very, very on top of the issues that you're facing and trying to help you address them, asking me to come and share with you what happened in Tallahassee at that FDOT meeting, and just letting you know that we're getting the message as staff that they're committed, and we are proceeding as we just talked about now. So I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have, but this is obviously a long, ongoing process that we'll take from here. Rhea?
Rhea?
Hi. What's your timeline for getting this plan together and getting something underway?
We have a green light again from FDOT to come back with them as soon as we can. So
Which is?
Alex and I are going to be talking about creating the vision and drawing for them what we want to have happen over the next couple weeks. We'll start to have local follow-up meetings with FDOT, I'd say probably within 3 to 4 weeks. And then if they give us the green light, then we'll go ahead and go back to the CRA board within that following month and talk about creating that pilot program. Again, we're not talking about getting permits to redo a street or something extensive. It's about a temporary pilot program that we should be able to do relatively quickly.
And which area are you going to look at that?
We're not sure. That's a very good question. There's about 3 or 4 obvious sections of 3-4 blocks at a time that we can look at. The key will be, remember what I said about the on-street and on-site parking. You've got a lot of curb cuts that are problems in that area. And the more curb cuts you have, who's ruling? The cars. So if we can get some of those curb cuts to close down, even temporarily, we can start to change how the cars rule, and we can put the pedestrians and businesses back in first place.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
We'll be back. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Kim.
Kim, thanks so much. That was terrific.
Absolutely.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.